Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the international edition of today's The Hindu newspaper, look at the articles in detail, and also search for the other areas in the vicinity relevant for the prelims as well as the mains examination. Now, today in total, we are going to have a discussion of around 10 different topics, eight of them in slightly greater detail relevant for your mains examination, as well as some areas can be extracted for the prelims, and then a couple of them for relevance only restricted to the prelims examination. Now, gender caregiving, the law in Indian research funding, this talks about the discrimination, the institutional denial of opportunity to the woman when it comes to research and higher education field as well. This is relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as some portions of GS paper 2. Strategic spark in India South Korea defense ties. Now, India and South Korea have embarked upon a newer set of collaborative ties with the visit of the defense minister following the visit of the Korean prime minister. So, that is where the article explores the various different avenues where the two countries can collaborate. That is relevant for your GS paper too. Unlearned lessons. This is about the strategic oil reserves that India has been holding and how limited it is when compared to the global peers, and why that is a dangerous thing to have in the present day geopolitical shock. Relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as for your GS paper 3. Waiting for the storm. The unprecedented number of deaths which occurred in Uttar Pradesh. I hope all of you would have seen the shots that we talked about, the hailstorms killing more than 111 people in Uttar Pradesh. Now, that is something which is alarming considering that this is the storm season still. You have so many casualties, so that needs to be answered for. So, that is relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as for your GS paper 3. Improving efficiency of fertilizer use in India. Now, the present crisis in West Asia has increased the fertilizer price, and that has increased the burden on the government as well as the burden on the farmers. But then in our country, the fertilizers which are being used, majority of it is not utilized by the crops. There is what is known as the fertilizer trap, very relevant for your mains examination. This is important for your GS paper 3. The warning signs in India's import bill. The fiscal situation is not very rosy. With the Prime Minister's advice, that has put to light the various different issues that the Indian economy faces as of now, the rising import bills almost in every other sector, and the limited amount of resilience that the Indian industry has shown. So, this is relevant again for your GS paper 3. Why has WHO declared public health emergency over Ebola outbreak? We will use this to understand Ebola, the strains of Ebola, and also what can be the overall curative factors. GS paper 3. Then, strengthening domestic energy security through decentralized bioenergy systems. Now, this is about the bioenergy, that is, through the various processes of gasification, anaerobic digestion, and how the waste which is generated in our country can be utilized. Very important again for your mains examination as well as for your prelims. This is relevant for your GS paper 3 and a couple of articles. We will take a look into it. India Norway Green Strategic Partnership. This is the second country with which India has arrived at the Green Strategic Partnership. Which is the other country? We'll take a look. And Indian Red Sand Boa. So there has been illegal trade, and that is where it has been caught. The live species has been caught. But we will use this to understand and to take a look at the features of Indian red sand boa, where it is to be found, and why it is known as the double headed snake. Now, before we move ahead with the topics for the discussion of the day, an announcement for all of you appearing for the examination. Today at 6 p.m., we are going to have a live session on YouTube on the same channel where we are going to discuss around 50 of the important MCQs of geography, ranging from physical geography to the case of Indian geography, the portions associated with the Indian maps, and the portions relevant for the examination. This should solve your revision issue and the headache associated with what to take a look into and which topics to concentrate for geography revision. So join us live at 6 p.m. on Unacademy IS English. Now, for all of you appearing for the examination this year, we have come up with the CSAT formula cheat sheet. Now, it talks about, or it is a detailed document of all the various different CSAT formula compilations and the requirements for the examination. The link will be found in the description below, from where you can actually download it and help in your overall preparation of CSAT. Now, coming to the first article of the day, relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as GS paper 2, that is gender, caregiving, the law in Indian research funding. Now, when we talk about the overall Indian research, now that is heavily male dominated, as is the case with the rest of the world as well. But we have to take care of India first. Here, the kind of the genders, in a way, imbalance that you observe is quite high. Now, why is that high? Why is it that you have more male representation and lesser female representation? That is what the article actually argues about. And this is very vital. If you take a look at the questions which are asked in examination for the mains, you will find that there are a lot of questions which are asked about the topics such as the missing woman, the topics such as the women underrepresentation, and so on. So, research is one of those forefront areas where you need more women participation. Now, what does the article argue? The article tells us that look, even though the constitution, under the part 3 part 4 of the constitution, it provides guarantees to women, constitutional safeguards to women. For example, article 15 and 16, they basically legitimize the creation of separate laws which favor women or which provide equal platform to women. Directive principles of state policy, they talk about the opportunity for equal livelihood and equal pay. Similarly, when we talk about the directive principle, that also provides a constitutional safeguard for women. But having said that, we have a lot of lacunae when it comes to research areas and really the empowerment of women in these areas. How? For example, when we talk about, let's suppose, the case of childbirth. Now, one of the progressive things that we have done is we have provided the maternity leaves, which are now extendable to almost 26 weeks. That is good. But thereby, this article also highlights a kind of a glaring lacunae. The paternity leave is associated with only around 15 days, which means what? The prime caregiver role is associated only with women. You don't have an institutional support for caregiving of the young ones, for the male members, for the grandparents, and so on. And even the women who are given this maternity leave period, now, for those who are in contractual work, for them, it is not guaranteed. So there is a kind of a biased field, right? There is no level playing field which is available. Now, when, let's suppose, after coming from maternity leave, the women rejoin their PhD courses or their research courses, then in that particular case, they are met with a very aggressive timeline and uphill learning task. Oftentimes, they are unable to meet that and they take a back seat. And that impacts the representation of women in higher roles. For example, the survey regarding the All India Survey on Higher Education indicates that when it comes to higher education and the faculty role, there you have 43% of women as compared to 57% of the male members, because many of the women candidates, they don't reach that post grad or the doctoral stage of research, and they take a backseat a lot earlier. Similarly, when we talk about the Science and Engineering Research Board, there also the representation is much less. So that is what the article talks about in a nutshell. Okay, let us compile them in point-wise manner so that it is easy for you to represent it when you are writing the answer. So the constitutional safeguards provided to women are manifold. First of all, when we talk about it, then Article 15.3 of the Constitution basically permits the state to make special provisions for women and children. Article 16 promotes equality of opportunity while allowing the corrective measures, right? Does not mean that the same law has to be applied. If, let's suppose, women are subjected to generational inequality, a disadvantage which is structural and systemic, there can be special provision, age relaxation, etc., which can be done. That is something which was argued in the Supreme Court judgment as well. We will take a look at it shortly. Directive principles reinforce the right of livelihood and even the case of equal opportunity. Article 51AE, that is the case of the fundamental duties, that urges citizens to renounce practices derogatory to women's dignity and also strengthens the argument to support the various institutional policies. Now, there is a legislative gap, as we mentioned. What is that legislative gap? For example, when we talk about the maternity leave, right? Now, there, the Act extended paid maternity leave to 26 weeks, right? For eligible women employees. Okay. Now, it mandated creche facilities in larger establishments. But not all the women members or the workforce is employed in a very structured or an organized employment facility. You have the researchers working in fellowships, project positions, or in contractual position. So that is where basically those appointments they fall outside the ambit, right? So when they return from these maternity leaves, they are faced with a substantial uphill task. Oftentimes, they are unable to fulfill that. Oh, obviously, because the other male peers have an easygoing condition in that case in comparison. And as a consequence of that, they start lagging behind and they fall out of the workforce. So, this is a legislative gap. Now, impact. Now, the survey data recorded approximately 16 lakh faculty members, and in higher education, women constitute only 43%, male members constitute a whopping 57%, which means women are not able to reach this stage. They withdraw a lot earlier. Women remain unrepresented in science, technology, and in senior faculty roles. There is a lower application rate and success rate for women researchers. Now, that is again owing to the case that even the funding agencies in majority of the cases, they don't have women representation to adequate proportion. Now, it is a systemic issue where if they don't carry out enough research, if you don't have enough women in the research positions, obviously, in the funding agency also, the women representation will be further less. So that entire system remains very male dominated. And that is where the systemic issue lies. So the article argues that there has to be certain policies, corrective measures such as age relaxation, right? Funding preferences. Now, this has to be done. Now, it is not to provide a kind of a bias to women, but to create a corrective measure for the systemic failures which the women face time and time again in almost every stage of their development. So that is the argument for age relaxation. The Supreme Court judgment in Vijay Lakshmi versus the Punjab University case that distinguished formal equality from substantive equality. It basically said that preferential measures can be taken which aim at correcting the real disadvantages that they face. Okay, so preferential measures can be taken. It is not a kind of a bias, but again, correcting the mistakes, right? And the entire argument, you have to understand this, that basically women, and UPSC has asked an essay about it, a question in essay paper as well, that women oftentimes face the double burden. When it comes to the family care, when it comes to the domestic care, that is where the entire responsibility falls disproportionately on women. Now, oftentimes, now obviously, they cannot give up on their family. So that is where the career is forced to take a back seat. Now, as a country, as an economy, as a society, we are losing out because of that. Now, that is where the institutional support has to be provided so that it nudges even the male members to take equal participation in that family care. After all, that it is not the matter of unpaid family care. It is not as if you pay the woman for the family care and they will be more devoted to the family. No, nobody can basically urge anyone to take care. But then you have to respect that the inequalities that they face in their path to progress. There are a lot of hurdles. As a society, all that you can do is smoothen that hurdle so that that double burden is not faced to such a disproportionate uh, limit. Age relaxation in research grants are intended for compensatory mechanisms for the structural the disadvantages. Okay. Now, here, what is the way forward that the article has suggested? Deeper institutional challenges such as childcare support, flexible workloads, the flexible timings, reintegration after the career breaks should be made and could be made much smoother. Maternity related productivity gaps, which oftentimes come in. Funding agencies should adopt flexible reporting timeline, especially for women. Re-entry fellowships, caregiving based extensions, and institutional support mechanism. Additional societal support and institutional support to be available for other caregivers, such as single fathers or individuals caring for elderly parents. So, if you reform the entire societal background, then you will have a long lasting contribution. And mind you, no society can progress with the contribution of only 50% of your population. A society can progress only if the 100% of your population is involved in overall progress. When we talk about the periodic labor force survey, time and time again, it has reminded us that the labor force participation of women in our country is abysmally low. Something which is quite comparable to the regions like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and so on. Definitely way behind, almost by 25 to 30% as compared to China. So that is where we have a lot of ground to cover. And for that, the institutional supports, starting with legislative measures, then going ahead with the other institutional support, that will go a long way forward. Okay? You can include that in the answer writing as well. Correct. Now take a look at the question. Discuss the issue of women's underrepresentation in scientific fields of competence. Mention the remedial measures. Now, there are various ways in which you can introduce the answer. One of the ways in which you can provide the introduction is to talk about the data pointer. That AISHE, the SERB data, all of that indicates women in underrepresentation. Okay, so that is where you can start with the data also. What it does when you start, sometimes not all the answers should be started with data. Only certain types of answers require to be starting with an empirical data. In this particular case, the requirement of the question is such that you obviously will agree to the question, isn't it? Now, once you agree to the question, you support that argument with the supporting data that you have. So that data you provide it, and then after that, in the body portion, talk about the systemic imbalances. Right. Systemic imbalances. Now, here you talk about the case of the uh, the huge uphill task upon joining the course or joining the research again, the kind of limited scope after the breaks that they have, limited funding that they have, the inflexibility of the funding agencies, everything you talk about. Then, if you have scope, what you can do is you can make a kind of a box here and talk about the constitutional safeguards. Okay. It will improve your presentation also. Just one pointer: Article 15, Article 16, what it talks about, Article then 51 AE. So, all that directive principles, fundamental duties that you mentioned. And then eventually the remedial measures that we have talked about. And in the conclusion, whatever we have talked and we have discussed, that is basically the corrective measures of the institutional support, etc., that can be included in the remedial measures. Okay. Moving on to the next article of the day: Strategic Spark in India South Korea Defense Ties. Now, basically, Indian Defense Minister is on a visit to Seoul, and that is to deepen India South Korea defense ties. Now, in the present day of a very tumultuous geopolitics and a kind of uh, an uncertain global order, India and South Korea are emerging as new partners in the entire region of Indo-Pacific. But India and South Korean India or collaboration is not something which is very new. South Korean industrial conglomerates have been operating in India for decades now, and that has been a success story. But however, when we talk about the case of South Korean companies, defense is one of the areas where the collaboration has got a huge potential, something which is visible as well, and something which has got tangible benefits. Some of the tangible benefits that you observe is the case of the K9 Vajra, right? These are your self propelled howitzers, artillery, basically. These are your guns, which during the Galwan crisis were deployed at the LAC, much to the deterrence of the Chinese aggression. So these are very mobile units, and they have increased amount of flexibility in the range of their deployment. Right. When you talk about the various different howitzers that we have one of them that we have imported from the US. This is something which is domestically produced. Right. So you have the 155 shells which are fired from this. This is jointly manufactured by the Indian company that is LNT along with the K9 unit of South Korea. Now, this is a case of a success story, right? In the infantry, in the artillery division, this has been deployed and this is being used. And obviously, the K9, the unit from South Korea is the case of the K9. Now, there is increased potential of collaboration even when we talk about submarines. Now, you would be aware that when it comes to conventional submarines, there are two types of broad classification of submarines for those of us who are not aware. One is the conventional submarine, which runs on conventional fuel like diesel. Then there is another submarine, which is nuclear powered submarine, right? For example, in India, you have the Arihant class, right? The Arihant, Aridaman, these are your nuclear powered submarine. Now, nuclear powered submarine can remain underwater for endless amount of time. They will need to surface only to basically restock, refuel, and basically only in order for the crew to change duties. Otherwise, they can run continuously and they can maintain the stealthy nature by virtually going anywhere around the sea. Very hard to detect. But when it comes to conventional submarines have to surface quite frequently in order to recharge their batteries. The battery systems, which are responsible for the air supply within the submarine. So, for that, the conventional submarines have to come up to the surface. You have various different classes of submarine. For example, the Sindhu Ghosh class, that is the Kilo class. Then, for example, the Scorpion class of submarines that we have, the Kalvari, all of these. Now, these are your conventional submarines, but they do need to surface quite frequently. There is a technology in submarine that is air independent propulsion, AIP. That is something that DRDO and LNT have been trying to develop for Indian submarines. Now, air independent propulsion, that is the technology. What it does, that it manufactures oxygen underwater itself. And that is where the submarines, even the conventional submarines, do not need to surface as long as the diesel fuel operates or runs. Now, Mind you, Pakistan has got this AIP technology in the submarines, conventional submarines, some of them. India does not. Pakistan, the import of the Hangor class submarines from China, which has been making news headlines in the recent times, that is installed with the AIP tech. Indian submarines, the conventional submarines, they do not have it. This is where you have the Korean technology and the Korean industries, for example, the Hanwha technologies. Now they have mastered this particular art. So, technology collaborations can happen where the existing Indian submarines can be retrofitted with AIP. And while DRDO works for AIP tech for the modern, newer submarines to be manufactured, this can allow for greater sustainability of the existing workforce. Other than that, you also have India facing an acute shortage of fighter aircrafts. All of you would be aware that one of the light combat fighter aircraft that India has manufactured, the LCA Tejas. Now, LCA Tejas is basically missing multiple deadlines. The Mark 1 LCA Tejas delivery has missed multiple deadlines, and it is still somewhere around fourth generation of a light combat aircraft fighter. Now, this is where the article argues that we can have a collaboration with the Koreans because the Koreans have been successful in manufacturing of KFA 21 light combat aircraft, which is much more sleek in design, modern avionics, something that India is seeking to do with the AMCA, the Advanced Multi-Role Combat Aircraft that India is basically developing on its own, which will ultimately be coming into the force in 2030s. So we are still some distance away. We need modern avionics for that. Okay, so that is again an area where collaboration for modern avionics, engine tech, etc., can be done. Right. So here oxygen within the submarines is basically manufactured using the fuel cell, right? So that is where the fuel cell, it carries out the electrolysis of water. Now, here, areas of collaboration. This is the KFA 21, the combat aircraft developed by Korea, which is much more developed as compared to LCA Tejas, much more airworthy in terms of the resilience and the airframe itself. So, there are defense techs where we can collaborate. We can also collaborate in terms of the industrial development for mutual growth of both the countries. Mind you, South Korea is facing its own internal structural challenges. That is the declining demography, right? People in the working age group, that population is declining, so it needs, so that means its armed forces, they do not have so many active recruits. Its industry will be requiring greater amount of skilled workers. This is where India can come together. Not only will we have the industrial expertise, the availability of the skilled labor force, but at the same time both the countries can collaborate as net security provider. So that is where industrial development, maritime shipping, and even the case of strategic partnership in Korean Peninsula. Maritime partnership is where again Korea has got a specialization. When we talk about this maritime, the Indian shipping ambitions to develop large shipping containers for transportation across the globe, we can borrow in some expertise from those regions as well. Okay, now, then coming on to the next topic, that is unlearned lessons. This is about the strategic oil reserves. Now, strategic oil reserves. What do we mean by strategic oil reserves? Now, the ongoing crisis in West Asia, or in fact, why do we limit ourselves when we say ongoing? Whenever there is a crisis in the region of Middle East or West Asia, that is oftentimes fueled by oil shocks, right? The price increases, be it post the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which eventually led to the formation of IEA, right? Or 1991 Gulf War, again, due to which India faced the BOP, balance of payment crisis, due to which we had to pledge our gold, we had to go to IMF to request a bailout, or even the case of the Iraq war, or even in the case of the Russia Ukraine war, and now in the case of the Iran conflict. The oil prices have increased and skyrocketed. Now, whenever this oil prices increase, many of the countries they rely on the existing reserves that they have built up. Now, India has been trying to shore up these reserves for some time now. But our strategic oil reserves, even though the government today can come and say that, look, when we talk about the strategic reserves, plus the oil marketing company, their tankages, plus the pipelines, plus the import commitments that we have an overall reserve of around 70 to 74 days. Right. But that is not very high, isn't it? You never know how long this crisis can go ahead, as is the case with the historical situation in the crisis in West Asia and so on. Oftentimes, these crises they rage on for months altogether. Now, as a consequence of this, what do you face? You face a sudden supply shock, due to which the price increases. As the price skyrockets, that means overall inflation increases, run on rupee happens, your currency depreciates, forex declines, RBI's ability to manage that inflation and forex that also declines. But still, one can argue that we still have around 70 to 74-day reserves, right? We do know that oil marketing companies were facing an everyday run of close to around 1000 crores because of the lack of increase in fuel prices. Fuel prices, the price increase was delayed, obviously due to the perceivable reasons that you would be aware about. Even today, the oil prices have further been increased by 90 paise. Right. It is not, it is one of the limited increase in oil across the world. Multiple different countries have increased the oil prices by more than 50%. But still, one can argue that if you would have had a greater amount of reserves, you could dip from those reserves and you could have a resilient supply system, isn't it? Your economy won't be so fragile. Now, despite multiple such warnings in the past, India did not act sufficiently. For example, take a look at China. China, throughout last year, has been storing around 1 million barrel of strategic oil every day for the entirety of 2025. That has further increased by around 25% every day in 2026. As a consequence of that, China today has the largest strategic oil reserves, higher than even US. Whereas India, even today, is languishing at somewhere around 36 to 37 million barrels. That's it. Right. So we needed to have more such oil reserves, which has not been done, should be done going ahead into the future. We have discussed this in much greater detail in the video about strategic oil reserves, where we have compared the case of India, China, Japan, US, South Korea, the European countries, the formation of IEA, the entire development of the strategic oil reserves program. Do take a look into this and you will get a detailed idea about this particular aspect. In India, the strategic oil reserves are being stored by ISPRL, Indian Strategic Petroleum Reserves Limited, isn't it? Now, there, if you take a look at the entire formulation and the formation of ISPRL, now it started way back in 2004, right? Where the Strategic Petroleum Reserve Project was approved in the final days of Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government, late Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government. And it approved the program for SPR. Thereafter, you had, during the tenure of Dr. Manmohan Singh, 2006 to 13, it was instituted as a special purpose vehicle. Construction of underground rock caverns were started in regions like Mangalore, in regions like Vishakhapatnam and Paradip. Now, around 2018, you had the phase one, which was completed. Okay. And after that, it has been expanded. You have the phase two, but again, one can argue that it is very, very limited in its scope, given the fact that India is the third largest automobile user across the world, right, after US and China. So that means we are very vulnerable to the price shocks. We have increased amount of dependence on the road transport. Our public transportation systems like metro, suburban rails are not developed. So that means that supply shock, that price shock will be felt by the larger population. So the argument can be made that we should have had a much better foresight and much greater amount of building of the strategic oil reserves. Now, in India, under the phase one of the strategic petroleum reserves, you had the development of the facilities in Vishakhapatnam, Mangalore, and Padur in Karnataka. Right? So here, Vishakhapatnam in Andhra Pradesh, Padur and Mangalore in Karnataka coastline. Now, the second phase is coming up with the facilities in Chandikol in Odisha and Padur again in Karnataka. This is the phase one and the phase two. There are discussions which have happened in the later part of last year about exploring similar storage regions in the area of Bikaner and so on. But yes, we need to act fast and we need to, for once, implement the policy on the ground with the same kind of urgency or alarm. Okay, do check out the video for the entire gist and the detail of that. Okay, now waiting for the storm. Now, last week, you had the sad incident or a kind of a disaster where more than 100 lives were lost in one afternoon or a couple of afternoons in Uttar Pradesh across 25 districts. Now, anywhere across the world, if this would have happened, it would have created a kind of a national alarm. 100 lives being lost, more than 100 lives being lost, is nothing short of a disaster. Now, in our country, first of all, there is always the unending argument that enough precautions have not been taken. But in the month of May, everywhere around the country, you basically have huge amount of these convective storms, hailstorms, etc. So the article argues that why weren't we prepared for this? Why wasn't enough inspection done about the hanging billboards, about the kind of unstable structures? And why wasn't a greater alarm created by the meteorological department as well? So that is what the argument is about. We can debate endlessly about it that there should have been better preparedness. I'm sure all of us will agree to that. But what we will basically concentrate upon in this case is that why this happens in the month of May. In the month of May, particularly in the region around Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, every year, this is a common instance of thunderstorms and hailstorms creating huge amount of uh, a kind of a disaster, loss of life, destruction. So why does this happen? So there are a couple of factors. First of all, the ground in this region, if you take a look at the background image, the region of the northern plains during these months that receives intense heat. Intense heat. The temperature is very, very high. Now, due to that temperature or the intense heat, you have very intense low pressure development, right? Low pressure development. What does that low pressure development do? Low pressure development from a ground surface will create the strong updraft. Updraft is the vertical movement of the air. A very strong updraft shall be created. Now, this very strong updraft under dry conditions will not cause anything. But if moisture is provided, then it will form very dense and thick cumulonimbus clouds. Now, in the month of May, that too in the continental area of Uttar Pradesh, where do you get the moisture? It is far away from the sea. That is where, during the month of May, you still have the traveling disturbances from the western part of Asia from the region of Mediterranean. That is your western disturbance. This traveling low pressure, it is a traveling low pressure which is created due to the difference of temperature between the Mediterranean and the colder regions of Central Asia. So, this traveling low pressure combines with the low pressure due to heating on the ground surface in northern Indian plains. So, you basically have two effects. One is the case of western disturbance, western disturbances, okay, and then the second is intense low pressure due to heating, right? Now, this western disturbances that provides basically the presence of moisture. Now, presence of moisture. Now, conventional wisdom tells you that western disturbances in India exist only during the winter months. That is November, December, January, February. It starts declining by March, it ends by April. But due to climate change, you have the climate variability experienced in Central Asia, due to which now the western disturbances are getting frequent even up till the month of June and July. That has been the cause of huge cloudburst incidents in the region of Himachal Pradesh, even in the month of June. Given the amount of heating which is happening across the Indian mainland, even in this month, one can be assured of similar level disasters in the region of Himachal and Uttarakhand, even in this year's June and July. And you can take a look at it on your own when you follow the news stories. So these western disturbances, they provide the presence of moisture they have dragged along from the region of the Mediterranean, plus a traveling low pressure. Okay, and intense low pressure due to heating in the region of the northern plains. Now that creates violent updraft. Violent updraft. Now, when we say violent updraft, what does that mean? Upward motion of air. Okay. Now, this, if let's suppose you consider the ground surface, obviously that means the low pressure on the ground surface is very intense. You have a very strong upward motion of air, and then the moisture is also being pushed up. You have formation of very thick cumulonimbus clouds, which can oftentimes span in thickness for almost 8 to 10 kilometers. These are multi-layered clouds. Now, in this, let's suppose, obviously, if you go to a greater height in the cumulonimbus cloud, you will have ice particles. Let's suppose the ice particles, they start to fall. Because they become heavy, they start to fall. Now, as they start to fall, they partially melt. But again, the wind, upward wind motion, pushes these ice particles up again, which causes immediate refreezing and recondensation. They become heavy again. Because of recondensation, their size increases. So again, they start to fall, aided by gravity. But as they partially remelt again the updraft is so violent that it is pushed up again. And eventually, the recondensation, this time which happens, what it does, it creates very large ice chunks, which are so heavy now that they cannot be stopped by the upward motion of the air anymore, and they simply fall on the ground as hailstones. Hailstones. And the phenomena referred to as hailstorms. Now, this will always be, in a way, accompanied by thunder and lightning. Thunder and lightning. And this makes regions in the plain areas For example, plain areas like Bihar, plain areas like UP, West Bengal, where you have large plain areas with outcrops of trees in certain sporadic distances, they become very vulnerable to lightning strikes. Oftentimes, it can happen that if you consider a large field, and let's suppose in that large field you have one big tree, you'll find 10 to 15 people taking shelter underneath that tree. A lightning strikes and all of them die. So that is basically because of the nature of the terrain, right? So these plain areas, whenever thunder and lightning occurs in increased proportion, the vulnerability of disaster tends to massively increase. So that is the case in Uttar Pradesh. We experience this every year. This time it happened in greater magnitude. What it calls for is better disaster management in terms of early warning system. That is where the normal radar systems tell you where the rainfall will occur. But you have what is known as the Doppler radar systems, which we have in our country, but we need greater amount of integration of Doppler radar systems. They not only tell you the regions which will experience rainfall, they will also tell you the amount of rainfall which will occur, the intensity of rainfall which will occur. And that is where you can basically prepare for that. Okay, so that is why Doppler radar system, then their integration is very much required. Okay, now clouds are not in vapor form. Clouds are basically condensed in liquid or in ice particle form. Hailstorm in Bangalore associated with the localized convection which has been created due to the heating of the Bangalore plateau. Mind you, the granitic rocks also tend to gain larger and a higher temperature. Okay, now then coming to another article which is very much relevant for your mains examination in a lot of news for environment ecology throughout last year, in the topics such as nitrogen use efficiency, and that is improving efficiency of fertilizer use in our country. Now, in our country, fertilizers, for most of that, we are import dependent, right? For example, urea. Now, urea is something which is produced substantially from the fossil fuels, right? So we import urea also. We do manufacture urea domestically, but we tend to import large amounts of it. Now, the crisis in West Asia has increased the prices of these fertilizers, which has put us in a very a kind of a difficult position. After all, fertilizer is associated with the food security. The article argues that much of the fertilizer subsidy, around 2 lakh crores of fertilizer subsidy that we provide, that is wasted because per crop we are utilizing lesser amount of fertilizer, we are wasting more amount of it. So that is why the efficiency is quite less. And the prime minister has basically appealed to the country to reduce the fertilizer usage by half in the next 5 years. Obviously, that cannot simply be achieved by waving of a wand. You need certain policy measures on the ground as well. So that is what the article is about. So import dependence is high, particularly in the case of urea. And this is where one cannot help but compare ourselves with China. Now, around 20 years ago, China and India were at the same position when it came to urea import. Over a period of the past 2 decades, China has built such a resilient manufacturing system of fertilizer. It is now one of the largest suppliers of urea across the world. India is importing some amount of fertilizers from China also. So that is where our production capabilities have not increased to the amount that it should have, right? It is dependent on the manufacturing of the fossil fuel. When we talk about phosphate, now urea provides what? Nitrogen. Overall, the plants need nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, right? Now, when we talk about phosphate, phosphate is again something where we are import dependent because it is dependent on the presence of phosphate rich rocks, phosphatic rocks, which are not present in large amount in India. There is conversation that rather than urea, let's start providing green ammonia. Now, in green ammonia, you basically carry out the electrolysis of water. But one has to understand that due to climate change, we are actually staring at a situation where water is also scarce. Water security is at risk. So, if water is scarce, then we cannot think about manufacturing green hydrogen to such an extent or green ammonia to such an extent, that too for agricultural purposes. So, green ammonia is again something in a distant future. The present reality is that we spend around 2 lakh crores annually on fertilizer subsidies, right, to keep the fertilizer prices consistent. More than two-thirds of these subsidies do not translate into food production and are effectively lost because what is referred to as the fertilizer trap. What is the fertilizer trap? For example, let's suppose you have a farmland. Now, in this farmland, you have provided fertilizer, right? Now, this fertilizer that you have provided in large amounts, what it does, it reduces the soil microbial activity, reduces soil microbial activity, organic compound, okay, and also the ability to retain water, water retention. So, in a way, the soil gets degraded, soil degradation happens. Now, when soil degradation happens, as a consequence of that, what do you have? You basically observe reduced production. This reduced production basically means that next season, next cycle, the farmers will apply more fertilizer, right? And that will further fuel the cycle. That is why post independence, we have seen, and the post green revolution, we have seen that despite a minor increase in the net sown area or the net acreage, the fertilizer usage has always been skyrocketing. Fertilizer usage has not stagnated in our country, it has been skyrocketing. And that means the soil in the region is turning out to be infertile. The case in point, for example, for the NPK, the ideal usage which is advisable to be added into the soil is in the ratio of 4 is to 2 is to 1. In regions such as in Punjab, you will observe that it is already at a whopping 36 is to 8 is to 1. In regions of Haryana, that NPK usages in many areas is around 27.5 is to 6 is to 1. So, what you observe or what you experience in this case is disproportionately high usage of these fertilizers, due to which the soil is turning out to be infertile. Eventually, this degradation, if it continues, cannot support vegetation beyond a point. Support vegetation, right? Beyond an extent. When it cannot support vegetation, right? Beyond a certain extent, that will lead to desertification. Sadly, that is what is happening in the regions of the green revolution areas of the country. And that is because of the fertilizer trap. And mind you, this fertilizer, increased amount of fertilizer that you use, then you put in that water, lot of that fertilizer drains off from the soil. There is that nitrogen waste which is emanated into the atmosphere as well, creating or emanating greenhouse gases, eventually leading to greater amount of global warming, right? Nitrogen oxides, that creates greater amount of global warming. It also leads to creation of acid rain. Other than that, the draining of these nitrogen fertilizers in the nearby ponds and lakes, that leads to eutrophication, harmful algal bloom, which kills the local fisheries in the region. So that is the case or the ill effect of the fertilizer. So The effort has to be that you should go for those kind of crop rotation techniques which are much more favorable. But here, for example, which crop techniques? For example, when you talk about pulses and legumes. Now, pulses and legumes, they have the ability for natural nitrogen fixation. Now, that is something which doesn't happen. Right. Now, if you grow pulses and legumes naturally after, let's suppose, a crop, now this has been done in our country for centuries. It naturally recharges the soil fertility, it makes the soil ready for the next cropping cycle. But our country sadly is trapped in what is referred to as the rice wheat cycle. Why? Despite the fact that MSP is awarded for various different products and the food grains, majority of the government procurement is restricted to rice and wheat. Right. Now, as a consequence, the farmers, they are not oftentimes incentivized to basically grow pulses. We are the largest users and producer of pulses, but still the price shock is huge. And that is where we are import dependent in certain cases. So that is why we need more pulse growing, more leguminous crops to be grown for nutritional security and food nutrition to be provided in our country as well. This is where the government basically announced the Dalhan Atnirbharta mission in October 2025, promised 100% MSP procurement for various different types of pulses like tur, urad, and masoor for 4 years. But then it has not been implemented to such an extent. The implementation for the government procurement policies needs to be much more substantially efficient, so that the farmers, at least from the next cropping season, they can grow this. Now, their way forward is not complete adoption of organic. After all, we saw in Sri Lanka that forced and sudden complete adoption of organic products and organic farming led to the economic meltdown in Sri Lanka. But what research has shown us is a unique case that in many of the areas, the yield per hectare that we are generating, much of that yield per hectare can be generated with the organic manures itself. Okay. Fertilizers should be used as add ons. Fertilizers as add ons, not as compulsive supply. Now, this only to augment the productivity, and not to be the basic production mechanism. Productivity, right? Because complete organic farming, like zero budget natural farming, etc., that is where you have the disadvantage of reduced yield. Okay, that is where you have the scare of the reduced yield. Now, here, one thing where we are lacking substantially is the case of research, right? The article argues that certain areas, for example, the newer research areas of the germplasm in uh, rice, has indicated of greater yield, lesser nitrogen use, and substantive reduced cost for the farmers. So the research in agriculture, organic, etc., has to be increased manifold, right? That research and development, rather than putting all your money in the drones, etc., that is where the government should be invest in research also. Okay, only then can we reduce the fertilizer dependency going ahead in the future. This is a very vital topic in relevance. Even for this year's prelims, you have the probability of nitrogen use efficiency being asked, and definitely in the mains examination, this is going to be asked this year or the next. Okay. Now, what is the fertilizer trap in Indian agriculture? Discuss the reasons for the declining efficiency of the fertilizers in India. The news analysis, the annotations of the PDF, in cases if it is not available, I will provide it in the Telegram group today. Don't worry. So, fertilizer trap in Indian agriculture, we have discussed. So, that is what you talk about in the intro. You talk about the fertilizer trap, greater utilization of fertilizers for supporting agriculture, leading the soil to be infertile. And so, what you can also do in our introduction is, rather than straight away describing the entirety of fertilizer trap, you just mention that Indian agricultural setup in many of the regions is heavily dependent on fertilizer in order to support productivity. Despite that, the yield per hectare in majority of the crops is half the global average. This is oftentimes attributed to what is referred to as a fertilizer trap. You set the context of fertilizer trap. Then in the body portion, you start mentioning the fertilizer trap. And always better to represent it pictographically, that like we have done here, in a chart manner, in a kind of a flow chart manner, so that it is easier for the examiner as well. So that you do it in the body, impact also you discuss. Okay, please follow in a 10 marker question 80 is to 20 rule. In a 15 marker question, that is 70 is to 30 rule. What is this 80 is to 20 rule? 80% of your answer will address everything which is asked in the question. 20% of your answer can also be dedicated to the surrounding areas which directly have not been asked in the answer. That is the 80 is to 20 rule. So provide that case of what are the ill effects. You can use it by bubble chart or a kind of a creative presentation where you simply talk about the case of the nitrogen emissions, increased global warming, acid rain, eutrophication, decline in fisheries, all of that you can talk about. And then the corrective measures in the later part, and eventually conclusion. If the largest population of the world has to be fed and agriculture has to be remunerative without being a burden on the government, the present system has to of fertilizer over usage has to be rectified by switching on into partial organic, reducing the fertilizer use, increased research into the type of crops, increased acreage, and like that you can conclude. Okay, then the warning signs in India's import bill. Now, this is a very interesting article following up from what we discussed yesterday as well and on Friday as well. Now, this article basically represents India's financial issues in the kind of a data format, and it is not very appealing. Now, the article basically talks about the fact that the Prime Minister making an appeal for national austerity measures. Now, that is unprecedented, something which India did not witness even during the time of the balance of payment crisis of the 1990s, early 1990, which tells us that Indian economy is facing severe stress. Having said that, and not to be very alarmist, we are in a much better state as compared to what people compare with the 1990s. At that point of time, we did not have a forex reserve of even $1 billion to support the import bill. Today, we are in a much better state as compared to that. Having said that, there's a run on Indian rupee. The Indian rupee has been depreciating. The forex reserves have been declining. Even though the exports have increased in the case of April 2026, but the larger data points to a kind of a lack of the growth in exports to the extent that it should be. So let's take a look at some of the data pointers which has been highlighted, and that is the crux of the article. India's merchandise trade deficit reached in 25-26 $333 billion, one third of a trillion. And that represented an increase of 17% over the past year. Imports rose by about 7%. Exports remained nearly stagnant, right, for the merchandise, not the overall exports. And according to IMF, crude oil prices increased by 53% since the war began. Now, that 53% has not been completely reflected in the oil prices, due to which the oil marketing companies, they are facing a run of close to around 1,000 crores per day. With the increase in oil prices, now that run has reduced to around 750 crores per day. Today, again, the oil prices have been increased to around 90 paise. So one can expect that the run that the oil companies are experiencing is moderated to somewhere around 600 crores per day, which is still huge amount of pressure to be faced by these organizations. When it comes to gold and silver, the precious materials, precious metals, this is where the situation becomes quite alarming. Okay, so here, import of precious metals exceeded $90 billion and accounted for nearly 12% of India's import basket. Probably that being one of the reasons for the Prime Minister to tell that or to convey not to buy gold so much. Overall, imports of gems and jewelry increased by 25%, but the exports have not increased to such an extent. India is one of the exporters of one of the major exports of India is gems and jewelry, right? We take in the raw material, we modify it to gems and jewelry, and then we export it. But the exports have not increased to such an extent, which means much of the import is for domestic consumption. Gold imports rose by around 24%, silver imports surged by around 150%. Now, the government, what it has done, it has increased the duties on gold, right, and silver. But it will not have such an effect on reducing the purchase of gold. Why? Because there are multiple aspects. First of all, the share market right now is very volatile. When the share market is volatile, people don't invest in markets, they seek more reliable investment tools, and that is where gold, silver, etc. comes in. Secondly, dollar presently is not very reliable. So the central banks across the world, they are trying to purchase more amount of gold to hedge against the dollar. There again, the purchase of gold can increase. So purchase of gold is set to increase, right? So even this duty increase will have a meager effect in terms of even the retail investment in gold. Other than that, some of the taxation policies that the government has introduced, for example, the long term capital gains tax, etc., that in a way dissuades the population to invest in the share markets, the equity market for a long run. Added with the STTs, the securities transaction tax, that is where the investment in the share market is something which is slightly discouraged. The performance of Indian share market and the stock market amongst the major economy is the worst, amongst the worst, if not the absolute worst, amongst the worst in the last year. So people naturally are moving away. The earning class is moving away. And where do they invest? Gold and silver, because this is inflation proof, right? So that is why this is set to increase. But what is very worrying, gold and silver, fair enough. What is very worrying is our import of edible oil and fertilizer. We have discussed the case of fertilizers, right? That we are import dependent. That price of fertilizer is increasing, so the import bill is going to increase. Edible oil imports also increased by more than 12%. We have not developed enough supply chains for edible oil manufacturing in our country, and that had to be done, right? So we account imports currently account for 56% of edible oil demand. Even in electronics, we have started exporting electronics, we have started manufacturing electronics, but still we are importing a lot of the electronic items. That is also where, despite the PLI scheme, despite the governmental support, the increase in production has not surged. This is where we need to relook at these sectors in order to ensure that the trade deficit is shortened and overall the economic health increases. Okay. Then, why has WHO declared the public health emergency, warning over Ebola outbreak? Now, Ebola outbreak has been there in the region of Africa, which has claimed multiple lives. And Ebola is something which can spread very easily, right? It can spread due to the bodily fluids from the surface in contact, and that is why it is very dangerous. Along with the fact that the casualty rate is very high. There are various different strains of Ebola. Now you have the Zaire Ebola virus, right? So average death rate is 68% in that. Then you have Sudan Ebola virus. The Ebola virus which is spreading right now is the Bundibugyo Ebola virus. The Bundibugyo Ebola virus, which has got a casualty rate of around 27%. Now, this is where from the surface, from the labs, everywhere, Ebola can spread. Now, Ebola is a virus which can be transmitted from animals to humans. So let's suppose fruit bats, they consume a particular fruit. From that fruit, it can be disseminated to other animals, and from there to the human population as well. Right? So it causes severe internal and external bleeding by attacking blood vessels, first identified in 1976. Now, here it can spread from gorilla, from chimpanzee, from the macaques, from antelope, pigs, and even the porcupine. Consumption of wild meat, touching objects that have been contaminated, all of that can lead to Ebola contamination. Okay? Now, relevant for your prelims overall. Now, the last article for the mains, that is strengthening domestic energy security through decentralized bioenergy systems. Now, energy security is an issue that the world is grappling with. The article argues that in our country, the organic waste generated is so high, huge, that you will basically require the, or if we utilize that organic waste, convert that into energy, we will be in a much better space. So the potential is huge, right? So we generate close to around 750 million tons of agricultural waste annually, right? Around 230 million tons are estimated to be surplus biomass. For example, the kitchen waste, the urban waste which is generated. Now, that lies vacant, gets is not treated adequately and ends up in landfills. That is where we can treat it, we can convert it into energy. And that can generate syngas, that can generate biogas, that can generate biochar, and that can be used for soil fertility, can be used for energy requirement, and so on. It can be used in decentralized kitchen networks and can replace LNG and LPG requirements as well. So, unlike conventional fossil fuels, biomass is inconsistent in quality. That is a challenge. It is not as if it is easily implementable that we start immediately manufacturing energy from biomass, because biomass also has got certain challenges. What are the challenges? It is not consistent. The amount of moisture varies from one type of biomass to another. Density level varies, and that impacts the combustion rate. So the amount of calorific value, the energy which is generated per unit weight of that biomass, that becomes variable. So as a consequence of that, what happens? Overall, the energy becomes variable. That is why it cannot be a complete replacement of your conventional energy sources. That is why in certain decentralized kitchen networks, in certain small settlements, that can be used. Now, there are various ways to utilize that waste energy. One of the way is gasification. What is gasification? Where dry biomass such as crop residue, husk, woody waste, and other solid organic materials, they are uh, burnt under very limited supply of oxygen through a method that is pyrolysis. Pyrolysis. So through the method of pyrolysis, you have the limited burning of this biomass which is done. Now, what it does, it produces syngas, right? Syngas, which is a mixture of carbon dioxide, hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, hydrogen, etc. That can be used to produce electricity, synthetic fuel, and even methanol, right? Other than that, it will generate what is referred to as the biochar. Now, what is this biochar? That is, when you burn these dry materials in limited oxygen, it generates a charcoal like substance. And that can be used as a source of fuel for small scale cottage industries. When you burn this, it burns with in the supply of oxygen and produces enough energy, right? It looks similar to charcoal. It can also be used to improve the soil texture. Water retention ability of the soil can also be improved if applied in small quantity. So, other than that, it can also be used as a source of fuel for the industries. Other than that, you have the anaerobic digestion, where wet waste such as the sewage sludge, food waste, animal manure, dairy waste, all of that, that is carried out in a way of anaerobic digestion. So microbes, what they do, they break the organic matter in the absence of oxygen, and it produces nutrient-rich digestate that can be used as a manure in the soil. Again, link it with the fertilizer subsidy and the fertilizer replacement, and it is relevant in areas of the urban ecosystem where you have a lot of decentralized waste generation. Both of these have to be used simultaneously. Both of them, if integrated and complemented with each other, can take care of the biogas requirement, the LPG replacement, because the LPG prices are also skyrocketing, building resilient ecosystem in the mountains, in the hilly areas, and ensuring that the price shocks don't happen. That is important for the mains exam as well as prelims. Now, a couple of articles for the prelims. Now, India and Norway have agreed to Green Strategic Partnership. Now, what is Green Strategic Partnership, by the way, even though it has not been defined here? Now, it basically talks about the case of climate partnership, climate partnership. It talks about the case of even when we talk about blue partnership, that is ocean, maritime trade, oceanic research, right? Energy security, non-conventional sources of energy security, because Norway can be one of the bigger suppliers of energy to India, right? Norway is also one of the pioneers when it comes to carbon sequestration, so that is where Norway can be a supplier. Now, India and Norway are not the first ones to arrive at the Green Strategic Partnership. Before that, India has arrived at a Green Strategic Partnership with Denmark also in 2020. Okay. And then after that, Norway in 2026. Okay. Relevant for your prelims. Now, Red Sand Boa snakes, they have been caught. They were being smuggled. They are one of the non-poisonous snakes which are oftentimes smuggled across the country. Large number of seizures happen across Telangana, Maharashtra, Central Asia. Now, this is a snake which is said to have double heads, the two heads. Now, what is this Indian red sand boa? Now, basically, it is a non-venomous species of snake. Now, average length of almost around 75 centimeter. Now, here you can see that the tail and the head are of the same thickness. That is why from a distance it is very difficult to say which is the head. Hence, it is known as the double-headed reptile. Okay, largest of the sand boa in the world. It is nocturnal and majority of the time in the burrow under the ground. It is found almost in the entirety of the country, excluding the northeastern and the region of the North Bengal region, and also not found in the islands. So in the plateau, the general Indian plains, you will find this. Status: IUCN near threatened as per CITES Appendix 2 and as per the Wildlife Protection Act Schedule 4. That brings us to the end of the discussion for the day. I hope the content has been helpful. Try writing the answers, and we'll meet today at 6 p.m. for the MCQ discussion live on the channel for geography. If you have liked the content, put that in the comment section and don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. We meet again in the evening. Take care. Goodbye. Thank you.